This is the Code to Cash podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Code to Cash podcast. This is your host Ajit, and today we have Joel Arnold. He's VP of Revenue Operations at Union Square Consulting. I'm so grateful to have you on the show, Joel, especially right after Christmas and New Year's. I'm honored to have you on and would love to, happy to have that conversation in the next hour or so.
Yeah, looking forward to having it, and thank you for having me on, and Happy New Year to you as well.
Yeah, likewise. Looking forward to making some money this year, especially after the bumpy 2023 we've all had. So, Joel, I've been very curious about your background because you worked at a couple of interesting companies and very senior revenue operations roles, as well as different operating roles. You've been a product owner, you've been in revenue operations. I would love to start the conversation with sort of discussing a little bit of your career journey and how you've come to sort of major in this field of revenue operations and what brought you here and what you're up to nowadays.
Sure. So, yeah, thanks for having me. I feel like my background is a little unorthodox, but then again, just about every RevOps leader that I talk to, they feel the same way. We did a sort of an informal research project not too long ago where we looked about 20 or 30 different profiles of sort of senior revenue operations folks that had some tenure to them. And there was really no rhyme or reason about how they got started in the field. We had finance people, we had Salesforce admins, we had ex-sales people and marketing folks. There really wasn't a single path forward. And I fall into that category as well. I never sought to be a revenue operations leader starting out in my career. And you mentioned product owner. So I guess I'll pick up the story of my career roughly about then. I went out in the world and was a consultant for a period of time and then went back to business school afterward. And then coming out of that, I was in a rotational program. And at the end of the rotational program at a big, I think, Fortune 250 financial services company, I found myself in a product role for the mobile app team for that. And it was actually a really interesting period of time where people were logging into their phones to check their bank statements as opposed to you used to log into your desktop computer. And we were literally watching like the logins go up on the phone and the logins go down on the computer. And I was actually in seat the day those numbers crossed. And so that was an interesting time. So we were doing some really innovative things. We were working with Apple on like Touch ID. That was the first app in the world at Touch ID, kind of at launch of that feature, just to give you a sort of a timeline here, 2013 to 2015 range. And we did some really cool stuff because the market had not been developed before. So it was a really fun time to be in product. Well, after that, I got recruited away to go work for a very large private equity firm called Vista. Many people in software space will recognize that name. And they placed me into one of their portfolio companies, more or less as a chief of staff role. I was there to handle whatever the biggest, hairiest project of the CEO there was that day, and did a lot of M&A integration work and rolled out HR systems and just did kind of a little bit of everything. So I'm well into the software game at this point and have never touched sales operations or revenue operations. And essentially what happened was after being in that role for, I think, 6 to 9 months or so, our sales operations lead at the time put in their notice and they didn't have a backup plan for that. So in addition to my regular role, someone said, hey, do you want to go take over that department too? And, I was young, I was ambitious, I suppose. And I was like, sure, let's go ahead and do that. And then the rest is history, really. I've kind of made a career for the last decade or so, working in what started out as sales operations, and then marketing operations got added to it, and then a host of other things. And before I knew it, a couple of years later, I had, I think, 13 direct reports and a global remit, and life comes at you fast, I would say. Yeah. And so that's how I got into it. I worked for that company for about 3 or 4 years, and then I left and did another 3 or 4 year stints at another company, also in Chicago. I'm local to Chicago right now, and worked a lot more on the CS side of things, had a more broad remit. And that's really where the full RevOps picture came into focus, where, there was a marketing component to it and a sales component and a CS component. And financial component and systems and technology and everything. And even for a period of time, I led the SDR team there as well. So it was a pretty broad role. And then I've kind of jumped from one PE-backed B2B SaaS company to another. And I felt after a period of time that there was an opportunity to sort of share what I had learned. I, through no fault of my own, got into the revenue operations game quite a while ago, and there weren't that many people doing it. And so here I am now with roughly a decade of experience under my belt, sort of acting as an advisor for leading up the revenue operations strategy function at Union Square Consulting. So
makes sense. I'm curious about something. Your whole story, I find it fascinating. One reason is, back in the day when you had actually mentioned that you'd made this transition, people were still having sales operations titles, at least to my recollection. Maybe my recollection is a little off. Yeah. What happened to make this change, right? What sparked the whole revenue operations, like, name change, purview change? And what have you seen in this, since you've been in this domain? Why has this profession sort of morphed in the way it has, or why has it taken off, quote unquote?
Yeah. That's a very big question. It's going to take a little bit of time to answer that. Sales operations has been around for a long time. There's always been somebody who's helping with the forecasts and writing comp plans and running reports and that kind of thing. As long as the CRM has been around, there's been some sort of function for that. I think what we saw is both an understanding of the power of this role if it was installed within a company, coinciding with a development in the technology side of the business, where suddenly every system, every function in the revenue side of the business had a need for operations. Policy, procedure, tech stack, etc. And the tech stacks got larger and larger and more complicated and more complicated. And
makes sense.
Eventually, if you had a marketing department that was siloed from your sales department in real life, just, leads come in, someone's not following up on them, or, sales is pointing fingers at marketing's pointing fingers back at sales and saying, we're doing great, but they're not doing their job, et cetera, et cetera. The constant tension that's just natural there. And you start adding technology to it, you can take a silo and you can kind of put up a moat and a wall around the silo, where it gets really bad in instances where you can run a report and say, these are my numbers, look at my numbers, they're the truth. And then someone else has another system and another report that has numbers on it that don't align to the first set of numbers. So you really calcify a lot of the problems that are in a business if you don't have somebody who's looking at the thing end to end. And I think that's really the genesis from taking a sales ops or marketing ops role and creating a revenue operations role.
Makes sense.
And in the world of subscription-based businesses, which have proliferated throughout just about every type of business these days, most notably in B2B SaaS, the retention and growth side of it, expansion, renewal, CS, is a natural extension of those first two.
Yep.
And you just look at the number of MarTech and sales tech and CS tech startups that are launched on an annual basis. And if you don't have somebody tending to that for your company, you're going to get left behind. And just add AI or generative into the mix. And if you don't have a revenue operations leader who's got some capability in your business, you will lose out to someone who does, your competitor that does. And I think that's why you've seen the elevation of this title in this role over all the last 5, 6, 7 years.
Makes sense. Interesting. Yeah. Thank you for that perspective. It completely makes sense. And the number of technologies that people are accessing even bottom up without any central understanding or stitched together is quite a lot. Like, I've routinely had instances in my previous work where my CEOs have just shut off technologies because they didn't even know whether they were being used and what they were being used for, let alone being reported on correctly in a cohesive view.
Yeah, absolutely. And you combine that with, I think there's no training program that I know of that does a really great job of teaching someone how to be a revenue operations leader. And the role means different things to different people. I have my thoughts and theories and ideas about what revenue operations is, but you go ask somebody else and they might think it's just simply technology. A revenue operations team is the CRM admins and people that manage the MarTech stack. In other places, it's just sales operations. It's just a fancy new title for sales operations. And what you're really looking for, if you aspire to follow what I would like revenue operations to be, you're really looking for somebody who can do many, many different things and wear many, many different hats. And it's very difficult to find a person like that. And so it's still migrating. I actually feel like the technology definition for revenue operations is starting to win out. And actually what I'm suggesting is what many people now refer to as go-to-market operations or go-to-market strategy as a layer in between, let's say, the C-suite and the technologists. So more as it develops, but it's not fully baked yet, even now.
Interesting. Makes sense. All right. So moving from there a little bit more into sort of the realm of the theme the podcast covers, which is the realm of monetization, while still sort of overlapping with your role. I'm curious about your own personal experiences with monetization in general. Like, there are many hats you have to wear in your role, including sales enablement, sales efficiency, and maybe things that I cannot even count right in front of you right now. But one of the things is monetization. And I've seen sometimes RevOps leaders even run monetization pricing strategy work. Sometimes it's just the systems piece. I'm curious if, in any one of your work experiences, have you had some experience actually having to run this yourself? And if so, would love to hear an example or two where you did get the opportunity.
Yeah. So absolutely, yes, I have had a chance to run, for example, the pricing structure and not just administer it, but also have a hand in sort of setting prices. And the monetization strategy. I've launched product before or been on the leadership team that launched a product in one or two cases as well. So I've had a little bit of flavor of it in a couple of different respects. I would say the biggest thing that I've noticed just consistently over time is that the ownership of pricing strategy is really, really important and often not talked about. And in many places, no one wants to own it, or there's not an obvious owner for it. Politics sometimes get in the way. And so revenue operations leaders end up being the ones who are in charge of owning pricing. And I think that's really dangerous unless they don't roll up to a revenue leader, which is also I think, not intuitive thing. So I would say start off, I would frame the conversation in like the org structure matters here. And it might not be the most salient point at the beginning of this conversation, just kind of like randomly bring up, but it is the most powerful and important piece of this whole story. If your head of revenue operations rolls up to your CRO, and you give them ownership of pricing and monetization strategy, then you're giving your ownership of monetization strategy to somebody whose job it is to hit a sales quota. And there can be a lot of unintended, but pretty obvious misalignments and sort of bad incentives that are generated from that. So just be careful with that. And then the second thing is if you want this person to own it, it needs to be a team effort no matter what. So no matter who is the end of the day throat to choke on pricing, you need to have a committee of people so that all the stakeholders feel heard, because you might say that we're not selling enough, let's say, or we're not getting the prices in the market that we anticipate getting, but that could be because sales doesn't know how to sell it. It doesn't know how to speak to value, is not enabled properly, doesn't have an ROI calculator that they can use. Or it may be that the competitor environment is telling us that we need to drop prices in order to win a deal. And who are you going to trust? And do you have the right seat at the table? So have the role of reporting through the organization and ownership and alignment makes sense. Then secondarily, have a team around it. And then thirdly, when you own this, you need to have process and structure. I mean, obviously I'm the operations guy, so I'm going to talk about process and structure, but that's the third sort of leg of the stool. And I think if you have those things, then typically you've got at least the leadership and the key stakeholders in the organization aligned around a particular go-to-market strategy and monetization strategy. And then it's just a matter of executing it. And you leave that to your revenue teams, your marketing and sales people.
These are some very, very interesting points. And even in my experience, I've been a little bit silent as you've been explaining this, because I have so far not been able to pinpoint one person who owns pricing in an organization. I mean, in every organization, it seems it's a different person. It's almost why consultants are hired in, I think, because nobody really owns it. And sometimes if people do own it, then they can't do their day job. I guess my question is, why is it sometimes it's not even clear to companies whether it is something they should be thinking about? Let me just start there. I think, yeah, org structure totally makes sense. But what has happened, like what have been the meta conversations inside an organization where some of these either the organizations you consult with or the ones you worked for, they realize, oh, we need to pay attention to this. Like what happens? What is sort of the thought process, or what do they start to see?
Well, they usually find out that they need to pay attention to it or have structure around this because I yell at them and say this is not working now. But what things would you look out for, I suppose, is the question. And absent structure and guidelines and having an actual strategy and an owner. When a deal needs to get across the line and we will do anything to get someone to say yes, that's great the first time that happens. That does not go well in the long term. And so your competitors will react. Everything is an infinite game. And just the game theory will indicate you will be in a race to the bottom very soon. So if you start noticing heavy discounting, inconsistent pricing terms from deal to deal, that kind of thing, those are some indications that you don't have discipline around this, and you may need to put somebody as the owner there. I agree. There are so many places, and I've been to several now, so many places where no one owns it or no one wants to own it, and it ends up falling on the person who's in charge of like administering a discounting system or tool, which means it's probably falling to like a relatively junior technologist somewhere in the revenue organization to administer your probably one of the most important value generating levers in the whole company. So don't do that. Things I would say.
From your vantage point, which is a very unique vantage point, because you can get to see what the strategy is, but you can also get to see how the sellers interface with it. And this is especially why I wanted to talk to you today. My understanding of sellers is that most sellers are incentivized to make more money, right? So what happens when, what is their incentive, or what is the seller thinking when they're discounting that aggressively? Because I would imagine that their own compensation is getting hit by this. And what is the right way to make sure that your sellers are incented correctly to your monetization strategy?
Yeah. Well, the most important thing is having everybody chase toward an overall number that we're trying to hit. If you need to discount, let's say, hit the goal for the end of the year, I don't think your board is going to have a trouble with that. What the struggle is that on the individual basis, everybody has an incentive to make some money for your sellers, to make some money in commission versus none. And if you don't have your monetization strategy aligned to a reasonable CAC, profitability, gross margin, whatever your preferred metric is, then in a pinch, if you don't have controls on this, someone will discount until it's a yes. And that's really the struggle. And then that's one interaction, or that's one transaction that happens, but you will get a response and the competitor will discount to match the price. And then suddenly, if you're not at scale and like drastically at scale, talking Amazon, Walmart kind of scale, it's very hard to win on margin, or sorry, to win on price alone. And before you know it, there you are.
Sounds like it's a slippery slope, and if you're not thinking about it correctly, not policing it, then it's very, very easy for people to get off. It's sort of like a drug. I mean, you do it once and you keep doing it.
Yeah, and we have to also understand that all software left unupdated and unimproved will become commoditized, like legitimately commoditized very quickly in any market that's worth chasing. And so you have to be constantly providing reasons and rationale for asking for premium and asking for significant check sizes And so it's all kind of circular, but within the entirety of the organization. And the monetization strategy has to be a product strategy as much as it's a marketing and a sales strategy too. And so another pitch for revenue operations is trying to have somebody whose job it is to kind of create those virtuous cycles that kind of feed back upon themselves and allow you to be successful.
So then, see, this discounting thing is interesting, because how do you? One is about having no controls, and sometimes I've observed adverse behavior with my sellers where they don't ask for a discount. They start padding up the pricing because they don't want to go back to management to ask for something, because they don't get a response. So what sort of controls do you set there to make their life easier? I'm just curious.
Yeah. So there needs to be a playbook in regards to pricing. And that playbook should come along with, pricing committee approved, stamped approved parameters for what is allowed. So generally that looks like, when you're selling this product or you're selling this bundle, the sales reps, sticker price is X. And they are allowed to discount up to 5%, 10%, 15%, whatever. Beyond that, they need someone else's approval. And you can create some automation and some system generated stuff to fire off a notice to the right person and have the approval captured, let's say, to the VP of sales or the CR. And then beyond a certain price point, even that person can't approve it because obviously there's an incentive limitation there. So then the owner of pricing at the end of the day, and this is why you do need one person who owns it, maybe a deputy. Let's say it's the CFO. At a certain point, the CFO needs to approve the discount, because usually a significant discount requires a significant deal for strategic and or just because of the size of it. And the CFO is going to have the best viewpoint as to, is this deal profitable or not? What are the impacts of doing this deal maybe at a loss? And how do we manage through that? So there's layers to it. The layered approach is better.
Makes sense. We're in an interesting market, and especially last year, a lot of it was getting harder to sell, and a lot of the times let's say hypothetically, you do win-loss analysis and you start hearing we're losing because of price. I've heard that so many times, and the seller will come back and say, well, we lost because of price. I'm leading the witness here, but I'm going to withhold my own conclusion. But like, how do you debug that, right? Is that price? How often is price an actual issue in losing?
Yeah, sure. So $10,000 a month for a stick of gum is a lot of money. But $10,000 for a Lamborghini is not. So it's really, you're losing on price to value and the ratio between those two things. And so what I would say to counteract that is, one, you don't ask the salespeople why they lost. I don't think that's particularly useful. I mean, it might be to get some rapid response information in a fast moving environment. But if you take the same deal and you have 3 people involved with it, you have someone from product, you've got a sales engineer, and you have a salesperson involved in a deal. And that can happen pretty often. You ask them why you lost. 9 times out of 10, they'll have a different opinion. So I actually prefer to have an unbiased entity do surveying after the sale happens or doesn't happen, and ask that question so you can get an unbiased result. But in the case where we actually are losing on price, I think, and this is, we published an article that I sort of wrote with the help of our marketing team not too long ago. It was talking about things to expect in 2024, given kind of the state of the business environment right now. And I think the losing on price thing and the losing on price is, it's part of the business cycle, because, when times are tough, then people want to cut corners and cut pricing wherever they can. I think a go-to-market strategy that might make sense from talking about monetization is more of a land and expand approach to things, starting with smaller, easier to incremental deals up front, but with a baked in upside. We'll do a proof of concept. If we meet these criteria, then this much bigger deal is guaranteed to happen, that kind of thing, just to kind of meet people where they are, because price consciousness is real, and we still have to try to make deals happen.
Makes sense. Yeah, it is a tricky time, and that's exactly why I asked you that question. Now, the second thing that I often get stuck, or I have gotten stuck in my previous roles. I have been the pricing person, and I have done the pricing strategy. Multiple, at least two companies, this has happened where the pricing strategy was not the hard part, but executing was major headache, both on the engineering side as well as on the system side. I'm curious what experiences you've had implementing systems, and maybe because of the experiences, how would you advise a company, how should every company have a quote to cash stack? Like, most companies don't even know the terminology actually when they're young.
Yeah.
So what do they need, right? Like, they need to sell software, they need, how many systems do they actually need, and how do they make sure that the systems don't come in the way of their strategy working?
Yeah. So you're familiar with the concept of technical debt, I imagine.
Yeah.
And technical debt doesn't just live in the product and engineering part of your business. It also rears its ugly head in the revenue side of your business because it is so
Mm-hmm.
technologically influenced. So I would say, how many systems do you need? You need as few as possible to do the job. You need as few as possible. I don't believe that everybody needs a Salesforce CPQ.
Mm-hmm.
You don't. You absolutely don't. And when you're in a relatively young company, that is an expensive outlay for
Yeah.
something that you should be able to manage with a small team on
Yeah.
your own.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just about policies and controls. We have had salespeople offering discounts um, since, I don't know, the caveman days, and we have been able to manage this without the use of the technology.
Yeah.
So I think you can make the technology makes it better. You can get responses faster. You can automatically alert the right people without alerting the wrong people and clogging up inboxes or annoying them. So it enables a speed to approval um, and a tracking of approval
Mm-hmm.
results
Mm-hmm.
that is incredibly valuable. But in most small companies, you don't need it. So is the question, how do you do it? Or what are some things you should do?
I would, my questions are like execution questions are interesting, but I think what is maybe even more beneficial is for people to know, should they be taking a step or not, right? So you mentioned one type of system, which is CPQ. The other
Mhm.
question is like, how do you lay out the map for, let's say, a CRO or a CEO,
Mhm.
right? Like, sometimes a
Yeah.
VC will say, hey, CEO, you should have this X billing system, or you should have Y pricing strategy, or you should have CPQ. And there's CPQ, but there is also other things the CEO is hearing about, right? There's so many of these
Mhm.
billing systems. What is is there is there less of an optionality there? Is that more of a required system? Are there
Mm.
systems? I'm curious about how this whole chain works.
I think it depends on the scale of the company. At a
Mhm.
certain point, you need to have these things in place and you need to be able to automate them because you can't have leadership involved in every single deal.
Yeah.
And there are too many moving pieces to avoid having something that's automatically going to generate a billing in an invoice, or at least an invoicing schedule at minimum for the accounting team to work off of. So yeah, at a certain point they are required. You have to have something. But I find that a lot of people jump into them a little bit too early.
Hmm.
And I don't know what that exact point is for your
Hmm.
business. But I always try to bang the drum of simplicity in everything as much as you can. The impact of being too complicated for the size of your own company, you will feel it. You'll feel like you're treading water and you can't get anywhere and you're working really, really hard and long hours and there's just too many things to get done and they're all high priority. Stepping back and ripping off some band-aids and like simplifying your business is really important, and not getting over your skis to begin with is going to help you so much. But as far as like some things to take a look at there, you're when you have different discounting, for example, or pricing strategies in different, let's say, markets or types of
Hmm.
businesses, you might want to start thinking about this kind of thing. Just as an example, like if you have a different pricing strategy in Europe than you have in North America,
Hmm. Hmm.
um, you're going to have a difficulty keeping a lot of that stuff straight and tracking the right stuff if you just have one policy and you're not using systems and therefore you're not capturing things and being able to report on them. If you
Hmm.
have one go-to-market motion with one pricing strategy, you
Hmm.
probably will be fine as long as you don't have a fairly, like an exceptionally long product set.
I'm also curious about this aspect, which I have sometimes hear from RevOps leaders, which is the concept for auditability. Like, how important is auditability, and when is that more important for a company?
It's that proverbial when your leaders are not involved in every deal anymore. I mention that because I have a lot of experience in an advisory capacity working with companies as small as like Series A, founder-led sales kind of a situation. And in those situations, auditability is, well, our CEO/founder said it was okay, so that was it. All right. So that's not very useful. But I imagine a lot of the people that are interested in this topic are in businesses where that's not the case, and there are several layers of leadership in between. So I think once you have more than one step between your salespeople and the head of sales, then you probably want to have something in place from an auditability standpoint. But that could just be your CRM. You say, this is what we sold, and this is the price that we sold it at, and you can back out what the discount was, and very easily with some, calculated fields or something. So it's just a maturity model. I apologize. I don't think there is a one size fits all kind of answer to this.
Makes sense. Yeah, I'm mostly coming at this from a curiosity thing, because I definitely have less of a window into this. And nowadays I hear a lot that VCs are telling like, I've actually had this experience where VC was telling CEO what to do. And I often thought, like, but the VC is not really knowing what's happening in the company. So why are they doing that? So I think that's my question. Why are VCs making operational recommendations that CEOs feel tied to act on? That's what I'm a little confused about.
Sure. So in the investor world, a lot of the funds they make a thesis, they invest the money, and then the whole point is you've got a company that you're investing in, and you want to try and make that company more profitable and more fast growing, et cetera, right? The whole rule of 40 thing. Oftentimes the secret sauce is that we've got a bunch of really senior experts who have done this many, many times before, and they do know what they're talking about. And we're going to inject them into the conversation and have them act as advisors and consultants and make recommendations on the operations of things. We at Union Square serve that role sometimes. And so every investment, especially one where we're talking potentially tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars, come along with a very deliberate plan about how they're going to increase the value and extract the value from that company. So I'm not surprised that you're involved in that or hearing that. Whether those recommendations are apt for that situation, I don't know, but I would guess that they probably put a lot of thought into it.
Makes sense. Yeah, that's because that's what I've been doing a little bit more research for my company, and that's what I hear, that VCs are making recommendations for more CPQ specifically. And my experience with it is same as yours, that for many smaller companies, it's a burden rather than a solution. So that was more what I was curious about, is why, on a more general basis, why the recommendation is being made. And that's why I asked the auditability question, because I thought maybe it's the auditability that's the reason that's driving these things.
Yeah, I think it might be an understanding that a CPQ implementation can take a long time. And if we're doing everything else right, you got a VC involved, you're tending to grow quickly, that it helps to control and provide visibility and consistency to a business. If you feel like you're going to need it a year from now, you might as well get ahead of it and start today and get people used to using it. And it is a balance, because I find so many times that people, especially early stage companies, kind of put the revenue operations best practices off to the side and say, we're different, or we're not ready for that. And by the time that they actually need these things to be in place, they've already installed some really bad habits and or bad technology. And to unwind it and start over is going to cost you at minimum a data set that you could have had over years. And at worst, I've gone into companies where they didn't know who their customers were. They literally lost track of them. They had left on the systems, didn't build a way to audit the system so that they could just tell who was turned on, and then lost the contract and weren't invoicing. They just have customers out there that are using their system, being provided the service. And we don't know who they are, but
They don't even
it's
know the
like,
customer.
they don't know. Yeah, literally, they hadn't, I mean, so they kind of sold a bunch of stuff very, very quickly. They grew really, really fast and then kind of threw it over the wall to a CS or implementation
Yeah,
team who
yeah,
stood them up, and then that person left, and then the next person in didn't get onboarded properly, and then
completely see how
yeah,
that
it
can.
it can get really hairy. It can get really hairy if you don't have this stuff, and it's sort of like, well, we're selling like crazy, we're growing really, really fast, so we'll leave that process improvement and policy stuff to
Mhm.
later, and then
Yeah,
later comes around and you've got a leaky bucket to end all leaky buckets.
makes sense. All
Yeah.
right. So one question which is us related, which is more trying to wrap up our conversation, but something
Sure.
more temporal. So in the last year and this year, there's been pressure. Like there's been people haven't been buying that much. There's been technology consolidations, as
Mhm.
well as some interesting things happening on in the renewal side. So what
Mm.
what are like broader themes that you seen companies go through as a RevOps leader? What are RevOps people going through, and how is it hitting systems or
Mm.
processes, right? Like process, I guess, is the bigger internally GTM process, GTM strategy, because it's been sort of a major pivot, at least from a macro standpoint, right? We were in a
Yeah.
high growth environment, then suddenly we went into a high inflation, high interest rate environment, and money became much more expensive. So I'm
Yeah.
curious what is happening inside companies when that is macro changes happening.
Yeah. So it was actually kind of interesting. I was sitting down with some frontline sales folks who had been in their careers, let's say, less than 5 years, and we were all talking about the last year and kind of listening to their experiences. And I'm obviously the old guy in the room, so I'm just kind of nodding my head and listening and listening. And they worked at various companies, and they all kind of said that my company did a round of layoffs, and maybe we cut our SMB business, or we stopped saying yes to as many deals, and they got more stringent on discounting and all these kind of things. I'm like, yep, yep, yep. And I asked them, did this all start happening about 6 months ago? And 6 months prior was when the Fed started drastically
Yeah,
raising the interest rates. And they were just kind of all like, yeah, yeah, how did you know that? The interest rate environment leads everybody to have to be more profitable, because you can't burn through cash as much because cash is expensive. And the result
yeah,
of that is you, as a business, can't sell the way that you sold before, and customers aren't going to buy it anyway. So the number of deals to be done drastically decreases. Those are just the mechanics of it. There's no way around it. But kind of the things that I'm seeing, I have seen a massive pivot in the focus area of revenue leaders
hmm,
away from new logo sales and into the retention and expansion side of their businesses. I've seen a pretty drastic pivot from just selling the classic 3-year deal on a SaaS auto renew contract into a motion that is more proof of concept, an initial 6 month or whatever deal, and then some really interesting clauses that kind of will expand the deal over time.
yeah,
Um, so you're trading maybe some revenue up front for a longer term kind of LTV play.
hmm,
Um, and speaking of LTV, like the CAC to LTV ratio is kind of the key revenue operations. At least it's one of them, and like the paragon of metrics that we look at. I think that you need to keep an eye on cash now. So what I've also seen is like deal structures being more cash forward where possible, where you may have accepted monthly payments or quarterly payments in the past, and now we won't do a deal, let's say, unless it's first year all up front with one invoice. What you'll have to do in an environment where customers don't have a lot of money to spend is you'll have to discount a little bit more up front to get the
yeah,
cash in the door, maybe.
yeah, yeah.
But I think the trade-off makes a lot more sense than it used to do that. So those are a couple of things that I'm seeing.
When I think one of the things that has been most interesting to me is the movement to more existing customers rather than where new businesses stalling. And what's been since you've had some experience with the CS side of things, there's been a lot of movement, and some people have said that CS leaders are under a lot of pressure. Some companies are cutting CS. However, in my view, if CS has become more strategic, and now you
Mhm.
are cutting CS, which is feeling a little contradictory to me. I'm not sure. Like, what is your opinion there? What's happening with CS, and how, like, you have expansion motions generally? Where have they lived? Have they lived more on the sales side or the CS side? And
Mhm.
does RevOps have a role to play there?
Yeah. Well, they're cutting CS, and I've actually seen quite a bit of cutting in revenue operations, and it just boggles the mind. So CS is often understaffed to begin with. I mean,
Yeah.
drastically so, especially in comparison to, let's say, a new logo sales team. The shift to CS, I think, is just it. It was a long time coming, and it should have happened a long, long time ago. If you have been around for any length of time as a SaaS company, the majority of your revenue is coming from the retention side of the business, and so your customers need to be happy with what they're getting.
Yeah.
I don't understand the
Yeah.
idea of not investing in supporting the CS team. And so I think there's a couple of good things that are on the horizon. If I'm a CS person, I'm looking at this whole broad situation. The first one is that re-emphasis on retention and customer success in general. I don't understand if people are cutting right now unless their customer base is drastically decreasing. You really do need to spend some time, if you're a business leader on the CS side or even in the executive suite, understanding what the capacity of an individual is in that seat, meaning a frontline CS rep, and not overburdening them with the numbers of accounts. I've seen, especially like SMB CS people, having to manage 150, 200 accounts. What happens in that environment is you can't handle 200 accounts. You would literally have one conversation a year with each one of them if you had 200 accounts. So you send out this mass notice to everybody, and whatever it happens to be. Hey, you should look at our new product. Whatever. Hey, would you like to have 30 minutes and we'll talk over your business next Tuesday or something? Whatever it is, you'll get a response from those that are engaged. So let's say 50 responses. I don't know. You'll meet with them, and that'll take up like 6 months of your time. Meeting with half your customers, but only the ones that were happy to begin with. And you won't get to spend any time with the ones that are not having a great experience with your product or with their implementation or whatever. So you have to get the capacity right. And then as far as the expansion motion, which is so important, and you will see usually about a 2x win rate on a deal that's from your current customer base versus one that's just a raw new logo kind of a motion.
Yeah.
And I don't like to conflate CS with sales. So my preference, and this totally goes in cycles, it's everything needs to be done by the CS person, expansions, renewals, everything, versus we don't want CS involved in the sales conversations at all. They're not salespeople. We hire a different profile. They're there to make the customer happy. The customer doesn't want to talk to a salesperson, all that stuff. And you kind of see this kind of ebbing and flowing at all the time. So what I would suggest is you do everything within your power to get your contract structures right, so that there are reasonable auto renew clauses, for example, and the process of renewing isn't a new negotiation and sale every time. If you have that in a healthy place, then I think it's fine to have a CS person in charge of that. But I would not make them the person who executes on the expansion motion. I would say maybe if they should have a playbook for identifying customers that are in a place where they're happy and ready to expand, or they have a new business need that just got bubbled up. Get that into some form of a salesperson's queue to follow up upon, and have that person run that, while the CS person is still seen as sort of a neutral observer whose job it is to make that customer successful and happy. And the combination of them tag teaming that, I think, is the best.
Makes sense. Yeah, completely. This seems to be such an area of tumult and opportunity, especially like I know Patrick Campbell is one of the thought leaders on the pricing side, and he has published articles where he said monetization of existing customer base is like a 5x more profitable than the new business, and because it also involves your sales and marketing effort. But even when I was working in a couple of different SaaS companies, this was sort of underlooked. Expansions was a little bit underlooked in terms of the investment from the systems perspective, as well as thinking about incentive compensation. And I hope, like, it seems like this is the biggest opportunity area to me, but nice to hear that you're also seeing that expansion is so important in terms of things getting right in this macro environment.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's for all those reasons, it is something that I can't believe it's taken us this long to actually focus on. Yeah.
Completely. Thanks so much, Joel. So those were most of my questions. I end most of my podcast with one question: is there
Sure.
something in the context of what we were discussing that I should have asked you that I missed asking?
Oh man, I think in monetization, the power of an ROI calculator as a piece of an enablement for everybody is really can be really powerful in the right context, and I would ask about that in the future.
Interesting. So you mean like most ROI calculators that I've seen have been sort of back on the envelope-ish Excel sheet sort of thing, like, hey, this is how many people you staff. Like it could be either like a cost saving thing or a revenue increase. You just mean something like that, something very basic. You've seen that work well.
Yeah, it can be it can work well, and it can be very basic. And the idea is that you can at least at minimum establish what value is being created. And then it becomes a conversation, if done right, it becomes a conversation of how you split that value up and that gets you at least a solid footing. Here's the thing. The human mind anchors on things, maybe illogically so.
Yeah.
But if you can run an back of the envelope calculator to say, hey, we're going to create 10 million in value for you.
Yeah.
And you're charging the product, suddenly that $75,000 or $100,000 doesn't look scary anymore.
Yeah.
Absent that, you're trying to explain why your software solution is worth $100,000 a year, and that's just a much more difficult.
Yeah, it's so interesting. This realm of monetization and pricing is not a quantitative thing, which many people think about. As a marketer, I've always thought it's a psychology problem rather than a quantitative problem, because you've hit the nail on the head. By doing the ROI calculation exercise, it's a positioning. You just repositioned your thing instead of like this whole like fight with the competition. You've repositioned it for like the value that I'm adding, and that's why I sort of paused into it, because it's such a simple activity which can have outsized results for your deal.
Yeah, and I think people need to recognize that in the world that we're in today, people always come up with this concept, oh, the way people buy is changing, or the way you market now is different. It's the same as what it was before. You're just using different tools and tech for it. What is maybe a little bit different in the manner in which someone buys, they still go through the same process of awareness and consideration and all that stuff. But a lot of it's more self-serve now. And so if a customer is speaking with you as a salesperson, or even as an BDR, even interacting with your marketing, kind of the late stage funnel, you're already in their solution set. You're already one of the top 2 or 3 customers, or sorry, not customers, potential vendors for them. Yeah, so you're actually gonna find less price competition. They're not shopping around at 10 different places. They don't have the time for that.
Yep.
So justifying your own value may be if the customer potential prospect feels like your product is very similar to one of your competitors, then maybe you're justifying the competitor's price as well, but at least you're starting from a higher spot. And if you do have to discount to beat a competitor within reason, at least you're starting from a higher spot and your discount won't be so painful.
Awesome. Makes sense. Completely agree. Thank you so much, Joel. Really appreciate your time on a winter in early 2024. Appreciate it. Thank you.